My people have asked that Malaya be given independence, if possible, during 1957. To the people of Malaya, I say, do your duty to your country. To obtain independence is far less difficult than to maintain it. I demand from you sacrifices and undivided loyalty to your country.
Tercapai sahaja merdeka, Persekutuan Tanah Melayu pun jadi ahli pertubuhan bangsa-bangsa bersatu. Dalam ucapannya, Datuk Dr. Ismail berkata,
"It is with pride and humility that I speak before you today.
Cita-cita utama kami ialah untuk memperolehi hak dan tuah hidup sebagai negara yang bebas, merdeka dan bersatu padu di antara negara-negara bebas di dunia."
The free nations of the world.
After independence, the British leave Malaya with a heavy heart.
Rose, Rose, I love you with an aching heart. What is your future? Now we have to part.
Everybody had this very enthusiastic spirit. We'd just been independent. The government, under the leadership of Tunku Abdul Rahman and Tun Razak, we were rich. We were the number one rubber and tin producer in the world. And out of that income, we rebuilt the country.
This is an exciting time for Malayans. Independence heralds a prosperous future that will be built on a multiracial society.
We need the Chinese to make things happen. And the Chinese need the Malays to maintain the stability of the country so that the business can run properly.
I must leave you now, but I leave my heart.
This progress encourages Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman. By his side is his trusted friend, Deputy Prime Minister Razak Hussain.
He was a good number two. He did everything. Tunku just preside, and Razak will bring him. He just ran through the agenda and said, "Okay lah, let's have makan."
Tunku's charisma charges a positive atmosphere, creating a conducive working environment. One of his most trusted cabinet members is Finance Minister Tan Siew Sin.
He said that Tunku was a great leader, but he was not a finance man. Numbers meant very little to him. He recalled that one occasion was about a budget, and Tunku said it was an awfully long string of numbers. And he asked my father, "Well, couldn't you round up the numbers?" My father said, "You can't do that because these are very big numbers, billions of dollars. You just can't round it up. Just make it easy for everyone to remember."
We were really representative of the aspirations of the people of Malaya, without taking into account whether we disagreed on specific issues and projects. Tengku wanted us to prosper and be stable and be happy.
I think it's because Tunku knew he could trust my father and Tun Razak to do the actual administration, that he could declare himself the happiest prime minister in this country.
With a strong team behind him, the country enjoys rapid economic growth. To outsiders, Tunku is easily leading his alliance coalition to another victory in the next general election. However, Tunku's next move shocks the nation. Meanwhile, Tan Cheng Lock, the president of the Malayan Chinese Association or MCA, and stalwart supporter of Tunku, had fallen ill and is replaced by a young challenger who brings with him radical new ideas.
MCA under Chong Yu started to be a bit arrogant and started punching beyond their weight.
Chong Yu publicized a letter handwritten by my grandfather, and in this letter, my grandfather supported Chong Yu's request that is Chinese language, Chinese schools to be on par with Malay schools, Malay language, and the request for apportionment of 40 seats out of 104 seats. The problem was that Chong Yu made these two requests public. So it was very, very difficult because it then seemed like an ultimatum by the MCA to UMNO.
Trust is now undermined by suspicion of treachery.
My father then realized what had happened was that Chong Yu had actually dictated the letter to my grandfather, who, of course, not knowing what he was doing, actually wrote the letter in his beautiful, long handwriting and signed it.
Merdeka was achieved through strong understanding and trust between the different parties in the alliance. Now this bond is being eroded by the actions of the young reformists. Unfazed by Chong Yu's requests, Tunku, as the national leader of the alliance, stands his ground. The reasons for Tunku's resignation in April now become clear.
I think Tunku was very concerned about the elections because this was the first election after independence, and he wanted a very strong mandate amongst all three ethnic groups. And he also felt that if he resigned, he could devote his entire energy and time to winning the election and not worry about the running of the government.
A determined Tunku decides he must make his move. He confronts the young reformists in the MCA.
Tunku issued a statement saying that UMNO was prepared to contest the general elections without MCA participation. Tunku's response was debated within the Central Working Committee in the MCA, and by a very narrow margin, MCA agreed to accede to Tunku's proposal.
But Tunku's firm stand can still backfire if it is counter to public opinion. The alliance will have to wait until the general elections in a few weeks' time to know the final result.
Keputusannya sekali lagi kemenangan bagi Parti Perikatan. Rakyat telah menaruh kepercayaan akan kerajaan yang diketuai oleh Tengku Abdul Rahman.
With this triumph, Tunku Abdul Rahman is reinstalled as the Prime Minister. Now Tunku turns his attention to an old enemy, the Communists. The emergency declared by the British in 1948 is still in place. 12 years later, Tunku wants to move on.
Dengan tamatnya darurat dalam tahun 1960, satu semangat baru muncul di dada setelah mengalahkan komunis selepas berjuang selama 12 tahun. Kini, segenap tenaga rakyat ditumpukan untuk pembangunan dan kemajuan negara.
However, the communists have not given up.
When it became clear that there was no way to secure their political objectives in Malaya, attention focused to the actions of the Communist Party structure in Singapore, and the aim was to eventually win political power in Singapore.
This development in Singapore worries Tunku.
The island of Singapore is connected by a causeway with the Malay Peninsula. The island is situated on the narrow Straits of Malacca between the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. Chinese firms control much of the large business and trade, and the population of the island is over half Chinese.
1950 Singapore is a nation in the throes of growing pains.
Singapore had a growing population that were essentially migrant, but not enough of an economy that could support that growing population. So those kinds of conditions were rife for political unrest.
There were many material issues which were grievances that the communists could exploit.
This could be a setback for the plan that the British have in the region.
The British, who were already thinking of gradual withdrawal, gradual sort of decolonization for Singapore, in other words, handing over power. They were not about to leave yet. They had a lot of interest to protect in Singapore.
The emergency may have ended in Malaya, but Southeast Asia is still a battleground of political ideologies.
It was about who would rule the post-war world, the post-colonial world. There was the free world led by the United States and Britain, and then there was the Eastern Bloc or the communist world led by Soviet Union and later China.
For the imperialists of the world, decolonization is seen as something imminent.
After the war, there was a general feeling that imperialism is out. So they were urging all the other imperial nations of Europe to give up all their colonies. So that was a general trend.
What they wanted was to see in Southeast Asia a kind of a post-colonial region that would be friendly to Western interests.
But the British have 3 remaining territories in the region to worry about: North Borneo, Sarawak, and Brunei.
The concern what the British were thinking about was that what do we do with these 3 territories, right? Leave them alone, continue holding on to it, let them federate into one territory, or make them join the federation that they were already thinking about.
The British encouraged Tunku to consider a proposal. It is an idea that has been in the works for more than a decade. It is called the Grand Design.
The Grand Design, I think, is a phrase that tripped off the lips of Malcolm MacDonald in the mid-1950s. The Grand Design looked attractive on paper, and it would certainly have got the British out of a hole in Southeast Asia. I mean, it would have enabled them to have retreated with, I suppose, in good faith, feeling that the colonial job had been done and a new nation state had been created.
The Grand Design would solve a number of objectives. You could decolonize at one go, so you don't have to do it in many phases.
They want to hand over this place and they want to put the Borneo state in the hands of people they can trust, and they could trust the Tunku.
However, the Tunku is not convinced by this proposal. He already has enough issues at home to occupy him. Meanwhile, in Singapore, newly appointed Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew is a man with a mission. He dreams of a Singapore independent from the British.
By 1963, the British had to decide what next for Singapore. Now, the possibility is, of course, give Singapore the independence that was scheduled to happen, but as its own country or as part of the Federation. The British were not sure that giving Singapore independence on its own would really work because it was too dangerous, given that you could have a Singapore that would turn communist.
Luckily for Lee, the British are inclined to grant independence, but only under the right circumstances.
When he became Prime Minister in 1959, he knew that he would have to try to bring Singapore into Malaya, and that's where he had to convince the Tunku. And he knew that the Tunku did not believe that Singapore should join Malaya. For reasons that are well known, he didn't trust the Chinese population of Singapore. He believed that if he took Singapore in, it would just complicate politics in Malaya.
And this is where the British role would be to try and convince the Malayan leaders, look, if you leave Singapore on its own, the risks of Singapore falling into communist hands is very real.
Tengku is a person who fears communism. The British tell him, if you don't go for merger with Singapore, then communists will take over.
Even if Tunku agrees to merge Singapore with Malaya, he must first appease skeptical party members within UMNO.
We were not interested in merger. The merger was more by PAP.
There was some fear that PAP politics infiltrating into the peninsula might change the priorities and the landscape that the Malays were comfortable with.
Tunku is also worried about upsetting the racial balance in Malaya.
You are adding a huge number of Chinese from Singapore into the Federation, and this will change the balance in terms of racial political strength.
But Lee knows that despite voices of dissent within UMNO, he only needs to persuade the man at the top. In May 1961, the British encouraged Lee Kuan Yew to discreetly submit a proposal to Tunku, outlining the benefits of the grand design. The proposal contains an idea designed to appeal to Tunku.
Why don't you start considering balance that dominance of the Chinese population in Singapore looks towards Sarawak, looks towards North Borneo, looks towards Brunei.
Later that month, the Tunku gives his response publicly.
So Malaya today as a nation realizes that she cannot stand alone and in isolation. Sooner or later, Malaya should have an understanding with Britain and the peoples of the territories of Singapore, Borneo, Brunei and Sarawak.
Those words spoken by Malaya's Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman.
He launched that bombshell, as he called it, in a speech at the Foreign Correspondents Club in Singapore and suggested that that was the way forward.
He didn't say that Malaysia was going to happen. He said the time has come for us to consider seriously the possibility of Singapore joining Malaysia.
Singapura waktu malam lampu neon indah berkilauan.
The decision to merge Malaya and Singapore is celebrated by all.
Partition of Malaya into two parts, into the Federation and into Singapore, was seen as a very unnatural act. Singaporeans saw themselves as Malayan. They saw Malaya as one country.
Everybody thinks that Singapore is ours, and there shouldn't have been a barrier. We could have gone in, shop in Singapore, come back.
It was the place where artists would go to. It was the place where you'd go to if you wanted to get a better education, if you wanted more opportunities. Singapore was basically to Malaya what New York is to the US or London is to the UK. It was the intellectual, cultural, artistic capital.
Since the inception of the People's Action Party in 1954, its manifesto has included seeking Singapore's independence through merger with Malaya.
Merger has always been one of the aims of Singapore's people. It started off after the war because we were in the pre-Merdeka generation, and we go to university and then we meet with the people from KL, from Penang, and we all feel the same.
If you looked at the concept itself, it's a beautiful concept from economic point of view. So if all could join, we could all enjoy the common denominator of development.
Now Lee Kuan Yew is hopeful this long-held ambition will be fulfilled. He also hopes merger will address the issue of growing communist influences in Singapore, including that within his own party. One of the radical left-leaning members in particular has caught the eye of the Tunku.
Tunku specifically cited Lim Chin Siong's, and I quote, talismanic ability to organize the people of Singapore, to organize the left. Tunku feared that Lim Chin Siong would come into a unified Malaysia and organize the left wing into this coherent force against the alliance.
He was observing Singapore politics for a couple of years, but as he watched the scene in Singapore, he became increasingly concerned that Lee Kuan Yew was losing ground. Lee Kuan Yew was becoming politically weak.
Tunku had recognized that it is important for the overall security of Singapore and Malaya, for Singapore to be part of the Federation of Malaya so the central government can control the security situation in Singapore.
Ironically, Lee Kuan Yew's political weakness is the key element needed to persuade Tunku to intervene. He believes a weak Singapore will become a hotbed for communism. Meanwhile, the Borneo territories present a different set of challenges.
So distant, They don't know whether the people of Sabah and Sarawak could integrate with us. They're not sure about that because some of us have never been to Sabah and Sarawak before that.
Generally, we did not understand the complexity of the population there. We had assumed that the tribal people were like our orang asli, which was ridiculous.
Regardless, the majority in the alliance put their trust in Tunku.
Although a lot of us were ignorant about the proposal, but I think we had faith in our leaders. That, I think, gave us the confidence that I think Malaysia will work.
Merger is rapidly proving to be an uphill battle for those planning it.
They were concerned about putting this puzzle together of these different territories with different histories and at different stages, I suppose, in their political and economic development.
On the northeastern tip of the great island of Borneo is Sabah, the home of the Dusun, the Murut, the Bajau and other races. Brunei, the ancient Malay Sultanate, which during the 15th century dominated almost the whole of Borneo. Largest of the three Borneo territories to join in the proposed federation is Sarawak, the land of the Dayak and Iban, Kenyah and Puna. Sarawak too has many Malays and Chinese among her people.
In the east, things are not looking any brighter. The Borneo leaders are apprehensive about the idea of merger.
The Borneo territories and Malaya had hardly anything in common. In Malaya, you have, for example, you have Sultan, you have King, you have three mainstream races, whereas in Borneo now has more than 40 ethnic communities.
People in Sarawak at that time, the level of education is still very limited. The understanding of what's happening outside is quite restricted. So their concern was if Malaysia, as they understood it, were to happen, what role can they play?
The political environment in North Borneo, Sarawak and Brunei were very different. You didn't have political parties, you didn't have a group of people who were very interested in politics. What you have was individual leaders within the community who were starting to have an interest in politics.
The Borneo people are wary about the intentions of the Tunku and Lee Kuan Yew.
Lee Kuan Yew wanted a federation between Malaya and Singapore. It made a lot of sense because Singapore had no natural resources. Tunku, on the other hand, look at if only Malaya and Singapore federate, the possibility the Malay will be outnumbered by the Chinese. And Tunku, without even having set foot in the Borneo territories, tried rope in the Borneo territories. So they both want Malaysia for different reasons.
Tunku heads to Borneo on a diplomatic mission.
It was alleged that the leadership in Malaya at that time was too assumptuous that Sabah and Sarawak were just like Malays. My complaint was that lots of Malayans, people from UMNO, for example, who visited there, they would make a speech, they will come out and Assalamualaikum, come out with hadiths, everything else. Then after the event, you realize the whole group was a group of Christians.
I think the Tunku probably was naive in thinking, if we get these Borneo people, they're just like us, and that will, racially, so on and so forth, that's a counterweight to the Chinese, job done. And it wasn't as simple as that, of course.
An influential North Borneo leader emerges to oppose this plan, together with leaders from Parti Rakyat Brunei and the Sarawak United Progressive Party, or the SUPP.
There was quite a groundswell of opposition to Tunku, and he went on a number of goodwill visits. It really stirred up a lot of bad will.
After the trip to Borneo, Tunku is unsure about the future of merger. The divide between the people of Borneo and Malaya seems too wide.
In North Borneo and Sarawak, there was no religious factor. For example, the development of UMNO and PAS in Peninsular Malaysia or Malaya was all about Islam, Malay nationalism and protection of the sultans. These were non-issues in North Borneo and Sarawak because simply Islam was not a factor.
Without the participation of the Borneo states, the demographic balance will not be to Tunku's liking. Tunku is adamant that the Borneo leaders must agree to the proposal if any progress is to be made. The Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, realizes he must take up the challenge.
I was told that the man who really wanted Malaysia to come into being, apart from the British, was Lee Kuan Yew himself.
Lee Kuan Yew is a real strong man. Everything he wants, he must get it. That is his character.
He wants to make a success. He wants to create this Malaysia. So if those people are not joining, I will go and tell them how good it is. It's not so much Tunku asking him. He wants it.
Malaya's Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman, needs the consent of North Borneo, Sarawak and Brunei to form a greater federation together with Singapore. Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew is determined to work hard to persuade them. But first, Tunku extends an invitation to the Borneo leaders to visit Malaya.
Meanwhile, representatives from Sabah and Sarawak called on the Malayan Prime Minister to obtain a first-hand idea of what the Malaysia plan would mean for their countries. In his usual sincere and frank manner, the Tunku explained that Malaysia would not only hasten their independence, it would bring untold benefits as well.
During the visit, Tunku's deputy Razak Hussain explains to the Borneo leaders the progress made since independence.
Most of us have some inkling of what Malaya was all about. It is not only Merdeka, it is Merdeka with an effort to develop our country to be better.
Razak takes the Borneo leaders on a tour.
We want to find out what is this proposal really about. We were shown around a lot of schools, a lot of new roads, a lot of new water supply, electricity. I was really impressed with the development that had been shown to us. And I even said this, that even besok pun saya bersedia masuk Malaysia.
Next, members of the legislative assemblies of Singapore, Malaya, Sarawak, Brunei and North Borneo decide to proceed with formal discussions regarding the idea.
The members decided to set up a Malaysian Solidarity Consultative Committee, and they discussed this idea that Tunku articulated in May.
Surprisingly, the committee appoints the skeptical North Borneo leader, Donald Stevens, as their chairman. For months, he has shown reluctance to the idea of bringing North Borneo to merge with Malaya. It is Singapore's Lee who recommends that Stevens heads the committee.
Kuan Yew was a very good personal friend of Donald Stevens. They meet up quite regularly, even before the idea of Malaysia was touted. They had a fair idea of how to work together.
The Malayan and Singapore leaders look at Donald Stevens as the most influential, the most articulate, and possibly at the time, the most literate of the Borneo Territories leaders.
Sambutan tiba serta-merta. Ahli-ahli mesyuarat dari kelima-lima wilayah itu melapaskan kesanggupannya atas gagasan Malaysia itu. Persetujuan ini adalah satu keagungan dalam persidangan pertama Jawatan Kuasa Perunding Setiakawan Malaysia di Jesselton pada bulan Ogos tahun itu.
Discussions are intense and many issues are debated. Ultimately, it comes down to one question.
There is nothing else they really want to find out, but to find out from us or from the people whether we want Malaysia or whether we do not want Malaysia.
Of course, Sabah and Sarawak, they're practically new to this idea. They're not so sure about their future. So instead of coming along with this idea of Tunku forming Malaysia, they were thinking of banding together with the 3S, Sabah, Sarawak, Singapore. They finally came to a resolution that all these territories should be one, including Brunei.
The committee recommended the continuation of the present system of the appointment of His Majesty the Young Di-Pertuan Agong as sovereign ruler of the new federation. The new states would each have its own head of state and its own constitution. Although Islam would be the official religion, there would be complete freedom of worship.
But the work is not completely done. While the MSCC is holding discussions, Singapore's Prime Minister Lee is facing tough opposition to merger in his own country. His opponents in the Socialist Front, or Barisan Socialist, say that the process must not be rushed. But Lee Kuan Yew has made merger a key pillar of his manifesto. Lee knows he must win the Singaporean public to his side.
Good evening. Soon, you will have to decide on your future. In the next few months, we shall settle the constitutional arrangements for merger. Merger is going to take place, not just because it's the desire of the PAP, or merely because it is the wish of the Federation Alliance government. It is as inevitable as the rising and setting of the sun.
He engages in a series of 12 radio broadcasts.
The battle for merger was really a battle for the hearts and minds of the population in Singapore, because it pretty much at that time determined whether or not Singapore would go it alone or become independent as part of a larger political entity.
Oh yes, it worked very well. The better for the merger. We went over the radio to tell people the merger with the Malaya is good for Singapore. Singapore cannot survive by itself.
Through the radio talks, Lee Kuan Yew cautions the public about a grave threat in Singapore.
If we did not join Malaya and form Malaysia, we can have a big problem with the communists.
He uses this to drive home the idea that merger would suppress or even eliminate the threat of communism in the region.
The idea that the communist forces were advancing throughout Southeast Asia was very much a concern and fear amongst the non-communist governments and societies in Southeast Asia. So the next question was, what's going to happen to Singapore and Malaya? Very much a front in the Cold War as well.
Lee Kuan Yew works tirelessly day and night. In the next few weeks, he uses valuable airtime to ensure Singaporeans understand the urgent need to win the battle for merger. Meanwhile, the Malaysia Solidarity Consultative Committee, or MSCC, continues its meetings.
At the third meeting in Kuala Lumpur, the Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman declared that all states in Malaysia would enjoy equal rights and status. But due to the special position of Singapore, the city-state would retain local powers in labour and education. The meeting discussed the economic and financial implications of Malaysia and what it meant in terms of national development. Piece by piece, the Malaysia jigsaw fell into place to produce a glowing picture of a vigorous young nation in the making.
It was Lee Kuan Yew who managed to swing their thinking around so that they would band together and support Tunku's idea.
And Tunku's plea of good faith assures the Borneo leaders that the future is bright.
Malaysia could not have been formed in spite of the hard effort put in by Lee Kuan Yew, if not for the fact that Tunku gave his personal assurances that he will definitely take care of the people of Sabah and Sarawak, not to worry, for as long as he is the leader of this newly formed federation.
If you put your faith in his hand, he will look after it and with all the sincerity at his commands. Because of that, I think it was very easy for us to sell Malaysia.
The successful ending of the conference was celebrated by a big cultural show in which all the countries of the new nation were represented.
The Malaysian Solidarity Consultative Committee proves to be a great platform for the leaders to discuss Malaysia. In November 1961, Tunku, Lee Kuan Yew and the British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, meet in London to advance discussions about Malaysia.
The conference of November 1961 agreed two principles. The first was that British defence interests in Singapore would be preserved, and the other was that the wishes of the Borneo people should be consulted, should be ascertained.
The British established a commission of inquiry to listen firsthand to the people of Borneo about their concerns on Malaysia.
Suruhanjaya Kabul yang memulakan kerjanya dalam bulan Februari 1962 menarik minat ke 55 wilayah. Maksud tugasnya ialah untuk menentukan pendapat orang-orang Sabah dan Sarawak terhadap pembentukan Malaysia itu dan membuat syur-syur yang sewajarnya.
It was chaired by Lord Cobbold, a former Governor of the Bank of England, and on it were 2 representatives of Malaya and 2 representatives of the British side who were there to, I suppose, protect the interests of the Borneo peoples.
Even at that time, there were still pockets of reservation in Sarawak. Not so much then from people from the rural country, but certainly within the more urban, particularly the Chinese component, there was still resistance to the idea of Malaysia. One of the arguments used to promote the idea of Malaysia is this sense of security. That security is, if you're alone, you will not be safe.
In the end, the voice of the people is heard.
Tunku Abdul Rahman in particular keep on assuring that there was no plan to colonize Sarawak. It is not Malaya's intention to do that. What he wanted was a merger of people who he said were from the same stock generally. While Malaya was prepared to share their expertise, it will give them better prospect of sharing their resources.
When we put this idea to the vast majority of the people of Sarawak, said, why not? We would like to be part of Malaysia.
They went around Sabah, Sarawak, persuaded the people. They were accompanied by the leaders who said, it's good for you.
Before going back home, Soviet Premier Khrushchev gets in some parting shots at the United Nations.
Могила колониальному рабству! Долой его и похоронить его чем глубже, тем лучше!
Not since the Second World War has so much animosity and division existed between 2 superpowers. One of the Soviet Union's allies in Southeast Asia is uneasy with the developments in the region.
He saw the creation of Malaysia as actually a neo-colonial creation of the British. In other words, the British in name pulled out, but actually they are still there through their proxies in Tunku and Lee Kuan Yew.
President Sukarno stokes the fires on the international stage to divert attention from issues at home.
Sukarno had a lot of domestic problems. He was making a very delicate balance between the communists and the military who hated each other, and he was maintaining that balance. Now, so he decided that the best way to deal with that was to turn attention outside. So when the idea of Malaysia was mooted, he said, what is this?
A diplomat at heart, Malaya's Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman tries to persuade Sukarno to back down from his aggressive stance. Nothing must come in the way of forming Malaysia.
Babak seterusnya kini beralih ke London. Persidangan penting mengenai Malaysia diadakan di antara pemimpin-pemimpin Melaya dengan jemaah Menteri British. Asas perbincangan ialah laporan Suruhanjaya Kabul. Selepas sekian berunding, Tunku Abdul Rahman dan Perdana Menteri British Tuan Harold Macmillan pun mewujudkan perjanjian bersejarah atas Malaysia itu. Agung dalam persetujuan itu ialah masa peralihan dan penyerahan kedaulatan.
The date has been set in London for the new federation to be formed. As with the Merdeka mission in 1956, when Malaya secured its independence, Tunku once again has shown a deft touch when negotiating the formation of a new nation. And he is one step closer to forming one of the biggest territories in Southeast Asia.
Jalan untuk tertubuhnya negara baru Malaysia itu sudahlah terbentang dengan jelasnya. Inilah yang dikehendaki satu teladan. Karena dunia pada waktu ini bergaduh berbagai-bagai, bergaduh kerana kelas orang ni lain, bergaduh kerana bangsa orang ni lain, bergaduh kerana bahasa orang ini lain, bergaduh kerana agama orang ini lain. Tapi bagi pihak kita, kita boleh hidup dengan baik, dengan manis muka, dengan perasaan kasih mesra antara satu dengan lain, tidak terkira apa bangsa, apa agama, apa merupa, apa kulit, apa pun kita tak kira, asal kita boleh duduk sama sekali sebagai satu bangsa. Hidup Malaysia! Hidup Malaysia! Merdeka Malaysia! Merdeka Malaysia! Saya minta rakan saya Encik Lee Kuan Yew bagi sepatah doa cakapan kepada tuan-tuan.
Sudah 100 lebih tahun Singapura menjadi satu pusat perniagaan dalam Asia Tenggara. Dan 1.600.000 lebih orang di Singapura adalah kebolehan, keusahaan yang boleh menolong negeri kita menjadi satu negeri yang lebih bahagia. Itulah maksud Persekutuan Malaysia. Bukan sebagai Radio Moskow cakap ini apa penjajahan yang baru. Kalau bukan kaki tangannya kuasai negeri, dia kata itu penjajahan baru. Tapi kalau kaki tangannya sendiri, dia kata itu bagus, itu kemerdekaan yang bebas, dia kata.
And of course, Kuan Yew cried, because all the things he had done went up in smoke, and Malaysia was not going to be the way it was conceived.
Triumphant moment for the Tunku and his associates.
The formation of Malaysia was squeezed in a very short period of time amidst a lot of uncertainties and also mutual suspicions for many parties.
He saw the creation of Malaysia as actually a neo-colonial creation of the British. In other words, they are still there through their proxies.
Jalan untuk tertubuhnya negara baru Malaysia itu sudahlah terbentang dengan jelasnya.
And well may the people rejoice in the Alliance victory. They are tasting the first fruits of democracy, the power to express their wishes through the secret ballot.
The Malays became very politically aware to the extent that they went to the level of seeking independence.
As president of the United Malays National Organization, or UMNO, Tunku Abdul Rahman and his party were given a strong mandate by the people of Malaya.
The British felt that the UMNO elites represented the Malay society that was there even before the coming of the British. So the British saw that in order to bring Malaya towards self-government or independence, you need to work with a party that would accept the monarchy as one of the various organs that would manage the country. And UMNO was that.
Predictably, the Malays are receptive to UMNO's role in running the country. However, the country's non-Malays were mostly immigrants who came to work here.
At that time, by wanting to have independence, you must accept the reality that there were Chinese and Indians in the country. And the British persuaded them that it would be easier to hand over independence to a multiracial representation rather than only Malay.
Political maturity brought these groups together to form the alliance.
Our political history is
a history of politics of compromise and accommodation. We say, let us share power. Let us work together. Let us give citizenship to those who are born at certain period, certain time.
The alliance by itself shaped the political reality of 1950s Malaya. This seemingly ad hoc coalition helped shape British ambitions for the region.
I think it is the beginning of the grand design, when they have an opportunity to start afresh and to go back into Malaya with a plan which they hoped would presage eventually a self-governing Southeast Asia dominion. And there was a lot of debate. Well, what will the union comprise? Should it comprise the 9 Malay states and Penang, Malacca and Singapore? Or is Singapore a special case?
Malaya's success in negotiating for independence gives hope to David Marshall, the Chief Minister of Singapore. However, the British have unique plans for Singapore.
People of Singapore, we came to London full of hope, full of faith in the justice and the reasonableness of the people of England. I cannot tell you how hard we have struggled, how much we have hoped, and how deeply sorry we are to have failed.
But ultimately, it was decided that Singapore, after the war, should be a separate colony. On the grounds of its status as a base, it must return to its military function, and also on the grounds of its economic, its trading activity.
Dejected by the outcome, Marshall resigns as Chief Minister of Singapore. His successor, Lim Yew Hock, tries a different approach in pursuit of independence.
There was a suggestion, even at the last minute, that there might be an attempt to try, even at this point, to try and integrate Singapore within the Federation of Malaya.
However, Tunku is not interested in welcoming a new state to his federation. He already has 11 to administrate. On the 31st of August 1957, Tunku announces Merdeka in Malaya, and Singapore can only watch from the sidelines. The island state will have to find another route to independence. Singaporeans are disappointed by the British decision to not grant Singapore independence, but instead maintain the island as their colony.
There was an anti-colonial struggle raging in Southeast Asia, and we identified ourselves with the anti-colonial struggle. And in fact, the purpose of going into the trade unions was to mobilize them as part of the anti-colonial struggle.
One of the trade unionists is the charismatic Lim Chin Siong, a co-founder of the newly formed People's Action Party, or PAP. Enraged by the union's demands and disruptions of peace, Chief Minister Lim Yew Hock incarcerates Chin Siong and several PAP leaders. One of the few party leaders to not get arrested is an ambitious lawyer. Lee Kuan Yew seizes the opportunity to prove his mettle.
The British were actually worried about the consequences of Lee Kuan Yew and the PAP winning power. And it was very much the case in the internal discussions that they were saying, let's wait and see.
Like Tunku, Lee uses the prospect of independence to bolster his election manifesto. When the day of the 1959 general elections arrive, Lee's campaign proves to be compelling. The PAP wins, and Lee is proclaimed as the first Prime Minister of Singapore.
British porticos in Singapore's centre remind you with a joke that the British made Singapore from the unsavoury lump of rock whose potentialities Stamford Raffles had the vision to grasp.
A few years after being elected to the government, support is waning for the People's Action Party, led by Lee Kuan Yew. Lee worries that he might lose the next election, which must be held within the next 2 years.
He was extremely unpopular by 1961. Many of the issues that were most important to Singaporeans, he could not solve right away. You can't turn the economy around overnight. You can't build new housing overnight. But what you can deliver to Singaporeans pretty much overnight is merger, as long as the Tunku and UMNO leadership agree. So what he needed was an issue that he could campaign on in 1963 and win the 1963 election.
But Singaporeans are divided over the proposal of merging with Malaya. One of the reasons is because the radical left-leaning members of the People's Action Party do not agree with Lee's idea of merger. In August 1962, after losing in a vote of confidence in the Singaporean Legislative Assembly against Lee Kuan Yew, the radical lefts in the PAP abandoned the party. They regather to form a new political party called the Socialist Front, or Barisan Socialis.
Barisan didn't want the merger because Barisan wanted an independent Singapore. PAP argued that Singapore's best prospects, right, were part of the Malayan Federation.
Barisan Socialis has constitutional concerns over the merger terms.
What Lim Chin Siong kept pointing out is that Singapore would be underrepresented in the Dewan Rakyat, right? We'd only have 15 seats, whereas we're entitled to 24. So fundamentally, Singaporeans have fewer rights. Are we then just trading one colonial master for another?
In a sense, many of us also felt that if we can't get merger on our terms, then we're independent. And that time, Lee Kuan Yew did not want it, because Lee Kuan Yew himself told me that we cannot survive as an independent nation.
Lee wants to put an end to this debate once and for all.
Kopi susu gula kasih, kopi susu gula dipancing. Jikalau nona cintalah sungguh sayang, aduh jiwa sayang, jiwa manis terbayang-bayang.
He will let the Singaporean public decide through a referendum.
The PAP pushed through a form of a wording of the referendum that was only 3 options, all of which were yes, and all of which had different forms.
No matter which way you vote for merger lah. So we were in a position, how should the Barisan respond? If we say boycott the referendum, the next election, none of us will be on the electoral roll. So we can't afford that.
On the 1st of September 1962, Singaporeans wake up to decide the future of their country.
Singaporeans, when they walked into the ballot box, only saw these 3 options. And so what are they going to do? So obviously you have to vote for option A, right? It's not a good choice, but it's by far the best choice.
When the results are announced, the public has voted overwhelmingly for option A. It is a thunderous success for the People's Action Party. More importantly, Lee Kuan Yew emerges as the victor over his political nemesis.
He was, a Cambridge-trained lawyer. He understood the British legal parliamentary system, and he used that to great effectiveness to completely outmaneuver the Barisan.
In many aspects, he and his friends had better quality of leadership than us.
For the Singaporeans, merger is now imminent. They look forward to the new nation Lee had promised them. This is all welcome news for Tunku and his alliance members. But the problem does not end here.
The missiles of 1,500 miles range and more were pointing at American cities. From Russian ports for a long time now, military supplies have been sent to Cuba. Not only rockets, but bomb-carrying planes.
The world is on the brink of nuclear war. Uncertainty ripples through the world. It is especially felt by the British in the region and their major concerns with their weapons stockpile in Singapore.
The British apparently had stored nuclear weapons in Singapore, and this was not something which was widely known at the time, but has come to light relatively recently. It was very important that Singapore didn't fall to communist elements, because you can imagine that if the facilities fell to communist elements in the context of the Cold War, you really would have a second Cuba situation.
Another immediate crisis confronts the Tunku. In Brunei, the North Kalimantan National Army rebels attack British-owned oil fields and police stations. In Singapore, Barisan Socialist comes out in support of the rebels that is closely linked to Azahari, the leader of Parti Rakyat Brunei.
We support Azahari because he is anti-colonial, but we don't support him in any other way. We don't give him money, we don't give him guns, we have no guns, we don't give him anything. Right. It was moral support, yes.
It was Lim Sin Siong's naivety, I suppose, to offer that support in principle for the Brunei revolt. He was linked with the Brunei revolt openly because of the meeting with Azahari.
This development worries Tunku. Before merger can be finalized, he puts forth a firm condition to Lee and the British.
He wanted the British and the Singapore government to act against the communist elements in Singapore first as prerequisite for merger, because Tunku didn't want to have to clean up.
The Brunei revolt is the last straw for Tunku on the subversive elements in Singapore.
When there is evidence that the Singaporean radicals are implicated, at least in discussions, with the leaders of the Brunei revolt. And so it seems this is obviously a moment to choose.
The stage is set for the Internal Security Council to act against Lim and his comrades. This list will forever change the face of Singaporean politics. Many of them are members of Barisan Socialists who have long considered what their fate would be if the authorities cracked down on them.
What can you do? Go underground, join the communists? You don't want to do that. So go away, you don't want to do that either. Now what are your choices?
Dr. Ismail Abdul Rahman, one of the heads of the Internal Security Council, believes these arrests are necessary for the Malaysia plan to move forward.
Being in charge of security and having to protect the nation, I think it was quite difficult for him because he had to put some of his friends in jail.
More than 100 left-wing activists and politicians are arrested.
One night, they came at very late in the morning and just took us all in. And I was taken to KL, kept in several police stations here. And eventually I was put in the detention camp in Muar.
Now, it's a big debate in Singapore whether those who arrested in Cold Store were actually communists, or was it a mix of communists and everybody else? I suppose it didn't matter, right? To the British, what didn't matter? What they wanted was not only to arrest communists, what they wanted was to leave a government that was stable.
Whatever the criticisms of Operation Cold Storm may be, it paves the way for a merger with Malaya. Meanwhile, the Indonesian government is unhappy with these developments.
Pada bulan Februari 1963, Soekarno sendiri mengumumkan penentangannya terhadap Malaysia. Kononnya, Malaysia adalah Nikolim. Sarawak jadi sasaran pertama agresi Indonesia. Dengan mengganas di kampung-kampung sepadan, pihak musuh bertujuan hendak menakut-nakutkan penduduk yang tak bersalah dan dengan itu menentang Malaysia.
Despite the hostile response from his neighbor, Tunku decides to carry on with the Malaysia plan. First, he needs to get Singapore and the Borneo territories to reach consensus on a final agreement on Malaysia. This is to ensure their concerns and safeguards are incorporated in the newly drafted constitution.
It is motivated by a desire of Sarawakian before they joined Malaysia to make sure that a lot of things which they thought ought to be done our way, preserving our autonomy in doing things on the ground.
For people in Sarawak and Sabah, that guarantee of freedom of religion to them is very, very important. It's always repeatedly highlighted in all the discussion leading to the formation of Malaysia.
However, there are differences amongst UMNO members about the terms of merger with Sarawak and North Borneo. One of them comes from Said Jafar Alba.
Based on population ratio, they would have more seats than Peninsular that has got bigger population. So he said that should not be a basis. So Razak told him, if we don't do that, then this state will fear they don't want to join us.
And the challenges continue for Tunku.
When we proceeded with the merger, there were very important issues that were not settled yet with Singapore.
One of them is on financial agreement.
Singapore's Prime Minister is bent on federation, despite a sizable non-communist opposition to it. What Lee Kuan Yew will not do, however, is give up such vital powers as control over finance.
Well, I don't think we can relinquish finance. We're running nearly all our services as state services, except defense, security, external affairs. We've got to collect revenue to be able to spend it in the way we want.
Some people have said that it's Malaya which has made all the conditions in this merger and Singapore that's made most of the big concessions.
Well, I think we made considerable concessions. They now feel that we were a little bit too harsh on the financial arrangements and so on. Well, they should have thought of these things.
Tunku has had enough of this negotiation. He places the responsibility of resolving these issues on his deputy, Razak Hussain, in London. After days of negotiation, Tunku is running out of patience with Singapore and Brunei. He directs Razak to call it off.
Tunku was not in a hurry, but Kuan Yew was, and the British, of course, has a time limit.
But Razak believes he can work things out with Singapore and Brunei. After a long week in London, Razak manages to convince the stakeholders. He sends Tunku a message to attend the signing ceremony. Yet, even at the 11th hour, there are outstanding issues.
Sultan Brunei pula, dia nak cari sebab masa itu untuk tak mau masuk Malaysia. Dia janji nak masuk, cari sebab tak masuk. Sebab pertamanya, dia nak jadi agung. Nak langkah atas kepala raja-raja lain yang kita ada ni. Kerana dia ada kekayaan. Kita bukan memandang kekayaan. Kita memandang keadilan. Dah masuk Malaysia, ikutlah aturan undang-undang dan perlembagaan Malaysia. Masa sampai hak dia nak jadi agung, jadilah.
The Sultan believed that he would have to wait in line, and why would he want to do so? He didn't want to surrender control of the oil to Kuala Lumpur. He felt that, why would he want to subordinate Brunei, the Brunei kingdom, to a larger federation when, it was all working very well for him.
Razak proceeds to negotiate the final agreement with Singapore. But Lee Kuan Yew is tough with the British on compensation for a War Department land in Singapore. This has further stalled the negotiations.
Even many of things are written on the back of an envelope. Constitutional matters written on the back of an envelope.
At midnight of July the 8th, the Malaysia Agreement was initialed, bringing to an end the last vestiges of colonialism in Southeast Asia. It signaled the birth of the new nation on August the 31st, 1963, and the reunification of ancient lands and peoples long separated by the forces of history.
Datuk Panglima pergi membaca ke tanah rata senja pulangnya. Kalau Saloma orang yang bijak, negara kita apa namanya? Kalau Saloma orang yang bijak, negara kita apa namanya?
Oh Malaysia, Malaysia, oh Malaysia, Malaysia.
The Malaysia Plan incurs Sukarno's wrath. He declares a confrontation against Malaysia.
President Sukarno saw the Borneo territories as naturally extension of the Indonesian concept. Basically, he wanted to be seen as first among equals in maritime Southeast Asia.
Philippines President Diosdado Macapagal lends his support to Sukarno.
Manila felt that the territory of Sabah was at least part of the original Sulu Sultanate. If Sulu was part of the Philippines, then Philippines had an indirect claim to the whole Sabah, and that Malaysia should not be formed without consulting with Manila.
Indonesia, supported by the Philippines, dismisses the work of the Cobalt Commission. They demand a United Nations inquiry to determine the true intent of those living in North Borneo and Sarawak.
The Tunku didn't have a choice because these two leaders refused to accept the Colbert Commission report, which is a British report. So they wanted a UN report, which is, as you know, more international.
Tunku decides to meet Sukarno and Macapagal in Manila to seek a solution.
I suspect these two leaders forced him into it and said, you want to go ahead with the federation? We want proof that these people actually want to join the Federation of Malaysia.
But Tunku's accommodation angers the British Prime Minister.
He was upset, I think, because he felt that Tunku was being weak. Tunku was having to ride two horses at the same time. He had to make sure that his relationships with Manila and Indonesia were good, as well as his relationship with Britain. And he was a regional power amongst regional powers, and one can see why the Tunku went along with that. Even though the Tunku may have tried to reassure Macmillan that it'll come out all right in the end, we're only doing this sort of face-saving exercise.
On the 16th of August 1963, 2 UN teams arrive in Sarawak and North Borneo to begin their tasks. But their work is withheld indefinitely. Lee's declaration angers the Tunku and the British.
Where is Lee Kuan Yew coming from? The British are flabbergasted by this, and this is unconstitutional and there's no right whatsoever.
But the British eventually decide to ignore the issue.
Just leave it. Just do not try and confront Lee Kuan Yew on this one. It's just not worth it. We're almost home and dry.
After more than a decade, Malaya and Singapore are finally reunited. And now they bring with them two new territories, Sarawak and North Borneo, now renamed as Sabah. It has been 3 tumultuous years for the political leaders involved. Challenges have been overcome and tough decisions made. For Tunku Abdul Rahman, it was the ultimate test for him as the leader of the newly formed federation.
We're very proud that there is such a person in Southeast Asia achieving independence not through revolution or violence, but more by negotiation and by wisdom, by tackling day-to-day political problems and charting out an economic path for the nation right from the very beginning.
But it won't be the last crisis he has to resolve. Five days after the inauguration of Malaysia, Singapore goes to the polls. The People's Action Party have kept their promise to merge with Malaya, and Singaporeans reward them at the ballot box.
And of course, the first thing that Lee Kuan Yew does, right, as soon as his local political opposition in Singapore are out of the way, is to start desiring an expansion to the rest of Malaysia.
Emboldened by their success, the People's Action Party now set their sights on new battlegrounds. The Malaysian capital city of Kuala Lumpur in the 1964 federal elections.
They contested in 9 seats, and all 9 seats were MCA seats. So this made it very clear that its aim was to displace MCA and project itself as a better partner for UMNO.
If they win enough seats, PAP will go into the coalition and replace the MCA. But UMNO is a party based on loyalty. So you can't break that loyalty.
Yeah, he crossed the line because he agreed not to contest the 1964 general election. He contested and only won 1 seat. He said he would be better. I'm quite sure he would have been better. But if he had done, the next thing he said, I want to replace you.
Lee Kuan Yew wants to spread his influence throughout the country. For him, this is his country. So why should you restrict him to Singapore?
Lee's action angers many members in UMNO. Recriminations become physical. Violence spills over into public areas. In July 1964, racial tensions reach a breaking point. Unwavered by this, Lee makes his next move. He campaigns for a non-communal policy under the Malaysia banner. This is perceived to be a direct challenge to the federal constitution.
We decided to form Malaysian Solidarity Convention. I was sent out to Sabah and Sarawak to ask them to join, so they all came. And then we have a big rally in National Theatre. We won equality for all races.
The campaign aims to challenge the Malay and native rights of the country, rights that were initially agreed upon by members of the alliance. Unsurprisingly, Lee again upsets the members in UMNO. One of his fiercest critics is the Secretary General of UMNO, Syed Jaafar Alba.
He criticized the PAP leadership. Kuan Yew, without mentioning race, he was taking, if you read and see his speeches, he was saying, Sabah, Sarawak, if we all get together, we are more than the Malays. So he was actually playing on racial undertones, but camouflage in the beautiful Malaysian Malaysia.
However, his idea is not new to the Malays. Dato' On Jaafar, the founding president of UMNO, introduced similar ideas in 1951 to his Malay party. Those proposals catalyzed his downfall. Similarly, Lee's approach does not sit well with the Malays. Just 2 years earlier, leaders from Malaya and Singapore had cooperated well in forming Malaysia.
You may have a common objective for which you are prepared to work together. But once the objective is obtained, then there will be differences and we can accommodate each other.
The tension between the two parties reaches boiling point in the Malaysian parliament. In May 1965, Lee Kuan Yew stands up to make his provocative speech.
Lee Kuan Yew spoke in English. Suddenly he spoke in Malay. Off the cast, no script. I was surprised myself. And he could speak better Malay than many of the Malay ministers across. And he was so embarrassed they sang down and announced it to talk in English.
Tunku is pressed to intervene before bad becomes worse.
He was afraid that a repeat of the riot in Singapore would happen here and they would harm not only the relationship of the people of Singapore with Malaya, but also would cause a lot of misery and unhappiness. So he said if this thing persists, probably things will not go well for the future.
The stress proves to be too much for Tunku. He gets diagnosed with shingles while in London. Lying in a hospital bed, Tunku makes a very difficult decision. And the first person he informs is his trusted deputy, Razak Hussain.
I was waiting to see Tun Razak. Soon after I went in to see him, he said, he showed me this piece of paper. He said, see, Tunku has just written me a letter and he wants me to get rid of Singapore. He has not told anybody about this decision. So it's just his decision and he wanted me to implement it.
Tunku asks Razak to quietly make the necessary arrangements with Singapore's Finance Minister Goh Keng Swee about the terms for separation. When Tunku returns home on the 7th of August 1965, he makes public his controversial decision.
I mean, for me, it is a moment of anguish because all my life I had believed in Malaysian merger and the unity of these two territories. You know, as a people connected by geography, economics, and ties of kinship. Would you mind if we stop for a while?
I think he failed to realize that he had to accept the political reality in Malaysia. And the political reality is Malay political dominance.
The news of the separation plunges the nation into shock.
There was no reason to separate. We were not wedded together long enough even to have enough evidence. It was more what we think could happen.
It took us a long time for us to form into Malaysia, you know. Now, why should you break up? Yes, we'll face difficulties. We have faced difficulties in Sabah and Sarawak also at the initial stage, but we didn't decide to break.
So much is lost by not having social and political cohesion among ourselves. So much. It's such a beautiful country. I'm one of the remaining ones of that generation. So when I look back and look forward, I feel sorry for it. It seems as though all that we did in the past has come to naught.
Perhaps Lee Kuan Yew was too ambitious for his own good.
One could never see Kuan Yew and Tunku working as a team, and possibly Kuan Yew was over-ambitious. I mean, like the island was too small for him.
Who wants to be Prime Minister of Little Island? He wanted to be Prime Minister of Malaya. And had he been patient, I'm quite sure he had played the game well, he might have become Prime Minister after Razak.
For Tunku's lieutenants, who worked hard to make merger a reality, separation was a difficult conclusion to accept.
He felt that separation was the lesser of two evils, that it offered the hope that with the parting of ways, both countries would be friends, and that one day the idea of merger would again be revisited when passions had cooled and when the bitterness had faded.